And then, when they had cut all the trees on the territory that belonged to the lumber company, but the rivers were not yet thawed, so they couldn't float anything, they would head to the nearest town. There was usually a week or two of wild partying in places like Chippewa Falls, Hurley, or Marinette before the ice thawed. Most woodsmen would collect their pay and head in town for a riot of drinking, fighting, gambling, and women until the water rose and the spring river drive started. Thousands of dirty, bearded loggers burst with repressed desires into communities like Ashland, Eau Claire, Marinette, and Rhinelander. In Superior, hundreds would link arms at one end of the main street and charge through the town, mowing down everyone in their path until they had cleared the streets. Fistfights in the spring were to loggers what gunfights were to cowboys, and competitive combat was a rite of passage. To the small town residents, it was like an invasion of Hell's Angels. But to loggers, it was a chance to prove their manhood. Here's a quote from the guy who's had the story about jerking the road straight. "I know you will think we were rather tough," wrote Otis Terpening, a lumberjack who worked all across northern Wisconsin in the 80s and 90s. "But it seemed that when we had been in camp 4 or 5 months, we were so full of life and activity, we just had to expand or die. One crew was always ready to fight any other crew, and when we was in some lumbering town, it was sometimes rough." At the turn of the century, a Lake Superior logger named Bulldog Regan was known for stomping on adversaries' faces with his steel-studded boots. He was the undisputed king of brawlers. Of course, they were also partying, not just fighting. This is actually a photo from the summer, but it's the same time period, and it shows you what these guys would have looked like. Prostitution was rampant. Today we think Hurley has this colorful history of prostitution, but there were red light districts in every northern town to serve the loggers when they came in spring.
Michael, was this picture used for a specific purpose? It says Exhibit M on
Exhibit
it.
M, yeah. This is a good story, we have time. In 1913, a state senator decided he had to eliminate vice in Wisconsin, by which he meant prostitution, and he passed he got legislation passed forming a commission to investigate prostitution in Wisconsin in 1913. And he held hearings all over the state. We've digitized some of the hearings and put them up on our website because it's one of the few places that working class women speak for themselves in historical documents. Women who were shop girls or whatever would come before this commission and explain how they lived. And basically what the commission concluded was that prostitution was there. There was no white slave traffic. Most of the women participating had chosen to do so because they could make a lot more money than working in a factory or being a shop girl. Also, he was thwarted at every step by town fathers in these towns because they needed the money. They needed the income from the loggers coming in. So that's why Exhibit M. This photograph was supplied to his commission in 1913. So once the rivers were opened and the logs could be moved, they were floated downstream. Specially skilled lumberjacks called river pigs would actually surf the logs downstream, like this, while if regular guys, probably like you and me, would have been wading in the frozen muck trying to push the stuck ones out into the current. The idea was to float them down to a lumber mill where they could be sawed. But of course, they didn't go uneventfully. If the front log got stuck on a rock or a shallow place or a sandbar, all the logs could pile up behind them. And what you see here is a log jam at the head of in the St. Croix River in 1886, and you can get some sense of how big it is by looking at these guys. Now, that's quite a log jam. Log jams happen every spring. Sometimes they stretched 2-3 miles back up the river. And the lumber company obviously couldn't have hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of lumber stuck in the river. It was very important to get these out. And so volunteers were requested to get in the front, identify the key log that was holding everything up, like the keystone in an arch, and get it out of the way. Sometimes they pried it out of the way, sometimes they pulled it out of the way, sometimes they blasted it out of the way. But no matter which way they used, as soon as that moved, all of this came down on them, and they ran for their lives. In 1919, a Washington state government commission concluded that logging was more dangerous than warfare. Here you can see what happened on that day at the Little Falls Dam. The shores beside some rapids in Wisconsin became veritable cemeteries. One rapids in Wisconsin claimed 27 lives in a single year. On Christmas Day, Wisconsin lumberjacks greeted each other by saying, "I hope you live forever, and I live to see you die." And it was not an empty formality. So every winter from 1880 to 1910 or so, thousands of men were cut off from the rest of the world, marooned in the Northwoods for months at a time. What they had in common was this very dangerous occupation we've just looked at, and no diversions except what they could make up themselves. And I want to read you now some of their own words describing what that was like. These are, this is a Chippewa Valley historian named William Bartlett who toured logging camps around 1910 to take pictures. In fact, we see a lot of his pictures here today. In every crew there would be, as a rule, those in camp for the first time. And it was for the benefit of these tenderfeet that the wonderful tales were related. A grizzled veteran would relate some astounding feat in or associated with logging operations, accompanied by the casual remark that this occurred the winter he worked in Paul Bunyan's camp. Some fellow campmate would then recall having seen the first narrator in the aforesaid camp, where he also worked, and would amplify and generally corroborate the story. Oh, sorry, I wanted to go one more. I'm ahead of myself, sorry. Can you back up the film on it? No. The logs ended up at lumber mills. This is a lumber mill in Holcomb, Rossholt, Wisconsin. And you can see the incline. The logs are going to go up into the mill and come out as boards. Then the boards get assembled into rafts, just held together with those vertical pegs you can see. And this is going through the dells, right about where the dam is, the bridge is. And they would end up in St. Louis, or if they came down the other way, into lumber yards in Milwaukee and Chicago. And this is where I wanted to read Bartlett's quote. You can see they're amusing themselves as best they can. These are bunks. They're two-story bunks. Guys in the top bunk hanging their stuff up there to dry. This is one of Bartlett's photographs. All camps had their storytellers and musicians and singers, recalled a logger from the Chippewa Valley. He told this to Bartlett. And these would furnish all the entertainment to be obtained 5 nights of the 7. If we didn't have any entertainers in the camp, we usually got all the concerts we cared for from the wolves that roamed the whole countryside. Another logger told Bartlett that everyone had to help entertain. He must sing a song, tell a story, or whistle. If he could not do any of these, he must put a pound of tobacco in the poor box, and that pound was good for 1 month until he had to put in another. Now, Otis Terpening, who I read an excerpt from his letter a minute ago, wrote a very long letter to Charles Brown about what logging was like and what the loggers were like. And I'm just going to read you one small part of that letter in the lumberjack's own words. If I can find it here. Afternoon, dinner seemed to put new life into the crew. The woods would ring with the blows of axes and the singing of saws, and it seemed that they would all cut loose a pine at about the same time. And the woods would roar. Some gangs, when the tree would start, would yell, "Watch out!" while others would shout, "Widowmakers!" and others would yell, "Timber!" The sleighs went groaning and chucking down the sleigh road, and every man was doing his best, and no shirking. Hear the logs sounding and thumping on the skidways, and as the sun got a little warm, the air was filled with the smell of pine. Oh, why did God give this old lumberjack a memory?